if you're here, I bet you understand the value of personal stories. But sometimes when we're trying to pull those stories out of others, it can be really difficult to get the level of clarity and detail that we want. But those memories are so priceless. So today I want to give you 5 expert tips for drawing those stories out of family members. Stay tuned. You've got the story, you've got the idea, you just don't know the steps in the process. If this is what's holding your memoir back, I have got the solution for you. The Memoir Method Checklist is going to take you through every single step you need from idea to published marketable book. And you can download it now at pageandpodium.com/checklist. A few years ago, I worked on a memoir for a man who was in his 90s. His stories were so fascinating, and what was even more interesting was that as we worked through the process of his memoir, it became so clear that many of his adult children had not heard some of these stories. And, even more interesting, some of the adult children had conflicting versions of this man's stories. It was such a treat to be able to deliver this book that had all of his stories in it. And even more so because between the time that the book was finished being written and the time that it came out, he had passed away. His family was so grateful for those stories and so grateful that they took the time and made the investment to actually get those stories out of him before it was too late. But too often, this is not the story I see. Too often, what I see is folks who regret not speaking to their older family members before they passed. I personally have similar regrets. I never got the opportunity to know my father's parents. I met my father's mother once, but I never met my father's father. And my mother's parents were gone when I was relatively young. So I never got that opportunity to really deeply invest in understanding who they were, what they had been through, what their greatest triumphs and disappointments were. But those things are priceless. And that's why today I really want to dive into some of the expert ways that ghostwriters like me and my team will draw stories out of people to make sure that we get all of those really rewarding details that I know you want to know about your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents' lives. So let's dive in. And first of all, I want to talk about why this is such a problem. Because the issue is not only the obvious issue, which unfortunately is that mostly we don't take the time to visit with our older relatives. The issue is also that it is not so simple to sit down with your family and get their stories. Now, this is something that I have experienced kind of on both sides of the coin because I'm a trained social scientist, but of course I wasn't always. And one thing that I can tell you is that in my time before I was trained to interview people to get these kind of deep personal details out of them, I tended to ask pretty shallow questions. If I didn't get the answer I wanted, I would just kind of move on. And sometimes I would be a little bit disappointed with the information that I got from my parents about kind of how they had grown up, what their parents were like. After the time that I had trained as a social scientist, I had so many more tools to really get the rich details out of folks I was speaking to. And I'll tell you, it's night and day. When you can figure out how to really invest in getting these stories, the information that you're going to get is going to be really different and much more interesting and useful to you as you're moving forward through your life. We all agree that these family stories are priceless and ephemeral, and yet something always stops us from getting that information that we need. And there are 2 main causes for this. The first is that we all naturally tend to devalue the meaning of our own experiences. I see this every single day when I'm working with people writing their own memoir, and particularly those who come to me and my team for ghostwriting. Very often I will hear the phrase, "I have never told anyone that before." And sometimes the reason is that it's a deeply personal story that they've kind of kept hidden out of shame or guilt or whatever it might be. But just as often, that thing that they've never told anyone before, the reason they have never told anyone is that they didn't think it was important. And we all do that. The natural human response to someone asking us to tell them a story is to either say, "Well, I don't have anything really interesting to say," or to kind of repeat these same one or two or three stories that we have gotten really good feedback from other people, right? When we tell those stories, we always get a laugh or a gasp or a lot of questions. Did that really happen? But truly, when you are on the other side of that coin, you're not the one thinking of the stories, you're the one being asked to share the stories. It very often is the case that you really want those kind of mundane, banal stories. You want the everyday experiences so that you can really understand who that person is, and often, more importantly, who that person was before you knew them. So we have to understand that most people are naturally going to devalue their own experiences, even if you explicitly tell them that you want those insignificant day-to-day details. It is just human nature to assume that no, they really only want your most exciting experiences. And if you're close to your family, you probably already know those. The second reason that it is so difficult to get these stories out of our family members is that oftentimes we forget what we've told people. So, very often, I will hear with my own family, I'll be hearing a story from my mother, and I'll say, like, I've never heard that before. And she will be very surprised that she hasn't told me the story. Now, my mother isn't even that old, but as we get older and older, of course, our memory gets to be not what it used to be. I'm already getting there, so I totally relate. And as we are trying to remember what we have and haven't told our family members, it can get kind of foggy in there. We're kind of not sure, and we certainly do not want to seem like we're just repeating ourselves, especially for older folks. That often can be a real kind of fear that you're going to be repeating yourself, and your family is going to think that you are having some mental challenges. So we certainly don't want to prompt that when we're the one asking the questions. But how do we know what our family has told us and what they haven't if we can't kind of ask those repeat questions, ask those follow-ups? So the good news is that both of these issues are really easily solved. This is not a mountain that we're conquering. This is just simply a set of techniques that can help us make sure that we are getting what we want out of our family members, that we are communicating to them how valuable their experiences are to us and how much we really want all of those day-to-day details as much as they are willing to share. So, as we are thinking about this topic, I promised you that I would give you some easy, practical tips, and I want to share 5 of those things that you can use to make sure your family stories are recorded and safe for all of the generations to come. Okay, so the first of these tips that I want to share is truly the most obvious, but it's also the one that I see people neglect the most. And that is you need to make time for your family stories. And during that time, you need to make sure you stay present. Now, I know you may be thinking, oh, well, of course. But I also know, particularly when we are in our 30s, 40s, 50s, we have so many family commitments, we have work commitments, our kids need us, our spouses need us. There are so many things going on. And it's very, very difficult if you're not used to sitting in stillness with another person. It's so hard to focus. The problem is, your loved one will notice that you are not being able to focus, that you're not present. Even if you're not doing things like fidgeting and looking at your phone, it still is really clear when you're trying to have a really deep conversation with someone and they are not fully mentally present. So the first tip that I want to offer you is that you not only block off some time, and by blocking off time, I literally mean put the time on your calendar, and when you sit down, turn off your phone, turn it on Do Not Disturb, and truly invest. Now, as you are sitting with that person, you are going to need to remind yourself or put that energy investment forward into the main emotion that I want you to bring to this interaction, and that is curiosity. When you sit down and you want to hear someone's stories, the biggest thing that is going to stop the flow of that process is if it is clear that you are going down a checklist. Do not do that. Instead, what we want to bring to this interaction is a spirit of curiosity, a spirit of really genuinely wanting to know more. And that's where my next tip is going to come in. As you are sitting with your family and you're listening to their stories, usually it's not that hard to kind of get them started. Now, the first story you hear may be a story that either you've heard before from that person or a story that's kind of lore. Remember what I said earlier? Most of us really believe that when someone asks us about our life story, what they're really asking for are the really exciting parts. So don't be surprised if the first story that you get out of your loved one is something that you've heard before. But here is where the magic comes in. Because just because you've heard that story before does not mean that you have all of the pieces of it. So the second tip I want to offer you is that as you are listening to this story, bring that spirit of curiosity in and use it to think of follow-up questions. Too often, when I was training people to be social scientists, I was training graduate students to do interviews with people. Too often, I would give them an interview script that I thought would last about an hour, that when I did it, it lasted about an hour. And they would come back with about a 15-minute recording. And I always knew exactly what had happened, and that was that they didn't ask follow-ups. Of course, there is an art to the follow-up, and it's probably not something you're going to be able to do right away. But the more you can lean in and remind yourself that you need to ask, oh, that's so interesting, tell me more, or go on, I would love to hear more about that. Or, even better, follow-ups that focus on the details. You will communicate that you are really there and invested and listening when you ask questions that are very specific to what your family member has shared. Now, I want to give you a specific example from a man that I worked with on his memoir a while back. So Victor James Hill, his memoir is called The Ignorant Man's Son. It is beautiful. I highly recommend that you go pick this book up wherever you like to buy books. But as Victor and I were working through the interview period where I was trying to pull these stories out of him so that we could write this eventual memoir, one thing that I really noticed was that a lot of the stories, it was clear to me, he had told them a lot of times. What naturally happens, as I was saying earlier, is that when we've told stories a lot of times, we really forget that they have even any detail at all, and particularly that anyone is even interested at all in the details. But what I found was that as I kind of asked a lot of follow-up questions, asked him how he felt at the time, asked him what he was thinking, asked him what his options were, he became so much more willing to share information with me. And in fact, there was a time when we were talking about a relatively, he thought, insignificant time in his young adulthood when he was working as an apprentice under a master drywall hanger, whatever those are called. And he very quickly told me how appreciative he was of this man and, how much he admired and respected him. But it was really clear that this was kind of something that he said over and over to kind of give credence to this man who had really taught him this trade that really pulled him out of a spot that he might have been in otherwise. But as I started to kind of ask him, well, how did that feel? What was that like? What was your relationship like? I could almost see on his face through the Zoom, I could almost see him kind of remembering things that he hadn't thought of in a long time. And some of those things were things that he wasn't really particularly proud of, but that as we talked through them, it became so clear how they had shaped who he was. All this took was listening to the story, stopping him, and saying, okay, but hold on. What was it like when that guy took you under his wing? What kinds of things did you do together? Did you, spend time off work hours? Did he talk to you about personal things? Just being curious and asking those follow-ups can make such a huge, huge difference. Now, if you're thinking, okay, but in the moment, I don't really know how to ask a follow-up. I can't think of it right when I'm sitting there. Oh, do I get you? This is something that training helps a lot, practice helps a lot. So the third tip that I want to give you is to get other family members involved. One of the things that makes an interview so much easier is when you have others in the room to also be thinking about these questions that they're curious and to also be posing these follow-ups. So bring in your brother and your sister, bring in your kids if they're old enough. What an amazing experience. I can't tell you how grateful I would have been as a child to have the experience of sitting and listening to my grandparents' stories. So bring your family into the room, talk to them, have them watch this video, talk to them about what your goal is, why this matters to you, and let them know that you would love some help kind of prompting your loved ones for follow-ups. Ask them about themselves, ask them how they felt, ask them how they're doing, and lean on your family members to help you think of those follow-ups when you are stumped. Okay, another tip, because those follow-ups can be such a bear, I know. I want you to also think about, as you are listening for follow-ups, I want you to think about the details. Now, the easiest way to think about this is to think of the five senses. So we have sight, smell, hearing, taste, and touch. As you are listening to your family stories, really try to put yourself into the environment. Try to see yourself in the world that they're describing. My best friend's mother had the opportunity, for instance, to see the Beatles live. Can you imagine? She lived in New York at the time, and in fact, she was part of a group of women who jumped over the fence and made a rush toward the stage. What a cool, cool story. But you know what? I have no idea what that was like. I've seen videos, but I have not lived through that time. I certainly don't know what it was like to be at a rock concert in the 60s. I have no idea. And this is where those sensory details come in. Start with sight. What did you see around you? What did the stage look like? Was it outside? Were you indoors? What were you wearing? How did you do your hair? Ask those sight questions. Then you can move on to smell if you don't get what you want, right? I bet it smelled a particular way there. You can ask about whatever is relevant, but think about those sensory details. That is really what you want, is to feel like you can imagine yourself there. So keep asking those follow-ups. Ask those sensory questions until you really feel yourself in this space that they are describing. Until you've got that, you don't really have the story. So keep asking the follow-ups. I promise it's going to be worth it. And my final tip, come back later. I said earlier that sometimes when you're listening to a story, you just can't think of the follow-ups when you're sitting there. That is a normal thing, and there is certainly no shame in that. But that doesn't mean that you should miss out on the stories that you're interested in. In fact, this is your family member. You have ultimate access to this person. So if you find that later, as you're thinking about those stories and you really wish you would have asked a follow-up, come back later and ask it. I cannot speak for your family member in particular, but what I can tell you is that most people really, really like to be asked about their life. They might not admit it at first because we do have a little bit of a cultural stigma, especially I think in the US, but around the world too, where we're kind of not supposed to be thinking about ourselves that much, right? We're kind of not supposed to. It feels like maybe a little braggy, or like you don't want the attention on you. We should put the attention on others. Come back, ask those questions. Now, you're going to have to warm things up again, right? As I told you, the first stories are usually going to be ones you've already heard or things that they think are kind of the biggest, most exciting stories. When you come back, you might have to warm back up, but ask those follow-ups later. One thing that can be really, really helpful is to think of the entire project of gathering these stories not as an afternoon, but as a series of interviews. Typically, when I'm interviewing someone for a full-length memoir, I will plan anywhere from 6 to 8 hours of just asking them about their personal stories. And that's not even their whole life. That is a slice of life that is going into their memoir. So this is not something that you're going to be able to quickly move through. And one thing that can really, really help to make sure that everyone is on board, the loved one that you are getting stories from, as well as the loved ones that you have, of course, brought in to help you with this project, if you lay the expectations from the beginning and make sure everyone knows that this is not a one and done, this is a series of 8 visits where you're gathering these stories, you will have so much better buy-in. People will be so much more prepared to give you their time. And the loved one who you are asking to share their stories is also going to be so grateful that you have let them know that you're scheduling all this time. It's not only going to kind of let them brace themselves for it, it can be quite an exhausting process. And particularly, I find that older folks will struggle a little bit with this. But also, when you let them know that you are planning on investing so much time, they know that you really care about it. That is such a different message to send to your loved one than, hey, can I have a half hour of your time? when you let them know that you really are serious, you really care about this process, it's magical. You're going to get such better stuff out of your family. And I know you want that. And trust me, they want to share it. Okay, as you're going through this process, I really, really hope that you are able to kind of dial up the work that you're doing in gathering your family stories, because I know, you know, these are precious stories. Once they're gone, they're gone. Let me know if I can help. If you decide that you'd like to gather these family stories into something a little bit more formal than an archival recording project, head over to pageandpodium.com/checklist. That's going to give you a really good sense of all the steps you're going to need to take to turn those stories into a memoir that people actually cherish and want to read in later generations. Until then, good luck getting those family stories. I know it's going to be so worth it. Happy writing. You know what they say, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And this is exactly what holds so many people back on their memoir projects. That is exactly why we created the Memoir Method Checklist, a full, complete list of every single step you need to take to get that memoir written, published, and marketed successfully. You can download it now at pageandpodium.com/checklist.